So I've really enjoyed our seminar. We've had 2 sessions. They've been quite interesting, already quite challenging. But the seminar as a whole tries to use what I want to call planominal thinking, to explore how we might move from the current world condition, which is characterised above all by the contemporaneity of divisive difference, to a condition in which something we might call planetary possibility becomes, we might be able to say, our given, if no longer our natural way of composing our worlds, that's to say, of worlding. So in this lecture, I want to examine some of the relationships between the terms that you've just heard, and in particular, highlight the concept of composition as a signpost that might point us towards some potentially productive modes of planominal thinking. So let's begin by asking, what might it mean to think of composition in contemporary terms? I'll begin from a quite conventional usage and then add 2 metaphorical registers that will take us from the making of art to the world's making of us. So for artists of all kinds, active in whatever period, composition has usually been understood as the process of creating coherence within a work of art by employing a set of quite exacting but also necessarily open-ended procedures that have accumulated over time to constitute the demands and the limits of the genre or the medium in which the artist has chosen or felt obliged to work. So artists nearly always adjust these procedures in various ways during the creative process, sometimes to the point of reinventing them. So that's the first and most obvious sense of composition in the arts. But more broadly, by a generously inclusive metaphor, composition may also name the ways in which everyone in the world composes, to the extent that they can, the worlds in which they live, the worlds close to them, the worlds within their reach. So if you accept those 2 ways of thinking about composition, then a third kind of approach, a more broad one that has no remainder, composition must also name the ways in which those worlds, which add up to the larger world, capital W, compose everyone in it. So the world composes as well. So there's 3 senses of composition that I picked up really from Gertrude Stein, because in her essay of 1926, Composition as Explanation, she used the concept of composition in exactly these 3 senses, and she combined them to give a trenchant account of her own development as an artist during the preceding 2 decades. And in the process, she demonstrated with a highly reflexive acuity how a modernist art goes about composing itself, how it contributes towards composing its times, while also at the same time being composed by them. So she said, for example, in her wonderful prose poem, I'll try and read it with her voice, "The composition is the thing seen by everyone living in the living that they are doing. They are the composing of the composition that at the time they are living in the composition of the time in which they are living. It is that makes living a thing that they are doing. Nothing else is different. Of that almost anyone can be certain. The time when and the time of and the time in that composition is the natural phenomenon of that composition, and of that perhaps everyone can be certain." She also spoke about how the 3 kinds of composition can become suddenly and self-evidently contemporary with each other. So of the First World War, she says that it made everyone not only contemporary in act, not only contemporary in thought, but contemporary in self-consciousness, made everyone contemporary with the modern composition. And so war may be said to have advanced to general recognition of the expression of the contemporary composition by almost 30 years. That's her idea of a sick joke. So 90 years later, can we speak in the same or similar terms about not only the metaphorical resonances, but also the actual mutually determinative connections between art making and the settings in which it is made and to which it returns. How might we explain composition today in the arts, in self-fashioning, and in the shaping of our social being? Are we still modern in the ways we picture our worlds, in how they shape us, and in how we might, as part of the invention of a different politics, compose them differently? Can we expect composition to bear for our time the weight Stein laid upon it in her time, working it as a metaphor able to integrate with a precise economy the complex relationships between artwork, being, and world? So in her time, this meant the relationships between artistic modernism, the personal and social experience of modernity, and the economic, political, and societal forces of modernisation. So can we speak now of contemporary composition when art being made today seems so diverse in all of its aspects as to defy coherent categorisation? When the world situation presents itself day after day as spinning into confused chaos, structural disintegration and violent disorder, in other words, into a state of unfathomable decomposition? If we can speak of composition, we'll have to be in quite different terms from those highlighted by Stein. We must speak instead, I suggest, of the compelling need for coeval composition at a time defined above all by the contemporaneity of divisive difference. So how we achieve this is perhaps our most urgent question. So in 2004, in November that year, a group of scholars and theorists and artists, critics and curators gathered in Pittsburgh on the occasion of the 54th Carnegie International Exhibition to grapple with the nature of our present contemporaneity. So then, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, we could pose the question in the form you see in front of you, in the aftermath of modernity and the passing of the postmodern, how are we to know and show what it is to live in the conditions of contemporaneity? So like all such deliberately loaded interrogations, this question carried a kind of plethora of presumptions as to why it was being posed, about its acuity in having identified a problematic, and about the kinds of implied answer it would admit. The speakers at the conference, from Frederick Jamison to Antonio Negri, through Rosalind Krauss and Gita Kapoor, to Mackenzie Walk and Nikos Papastigadis, explored this question from a variety of perspectives. So in my introduction to this book, to the conference, which led to the introduction to the book, you see on the screen, I drew on the layered complexity of meanings inherent in the word contemporary and the changes of priority over time, notably the displacement of the set of meanings associated with the word modern, which had retreated from its centrality as a periodizing term and had become as a kind of lingering subset within a notion of, at that time, called the contemporary. So the core claim that I made has been cited a number of times. I said if we were to generalise this quality against its grain as a key to world picturing, we'd see the constituent features manifest to the virtual exclusion of other explanations. We'd see then that contemporaneity, and I'll put in brackets today, consists precisely in the acceleration, ubiquity and constancy of radical disjunctures of perception, of mismatching ways of seeing and valuing the same world, in the actual coincidence of asynchronous temporalities, in the jostling contingency of various cultural and social multiplicities, all thrown together in ways that highlight the fast-growing inequalities between them. So in those years, questions about the current world condition were being asked, in fact, in all spheres, from the most public of media to the most esoteric of academic disciplines, and they're clearly being asked much more urgently, I think, now. So one reason they were asked then, and even more so now, is the almost total collapse of what used to be called the Washington consensus model of geopolitics. This is the claim for hegemony in 1989 in what seemed to be the end of the Cold War of this consensus. The hegemony, however, was never achieved. But despite mounting evidence of that, as late as 2012, in his essay Making Modernity Work, The Reconciliation of Capitalism and Democracy, Gideon Rose, the editor of the influential journal Foreign Affairs, had no doubts about its success. So in this very issue, he claimed the following: the major battles about how to structure modern politics and economics were fought in the first half of the last century, and they ended with the emergence of the most successful system the world has ever seen, the post-war order of mutually supportive liberal democracies with mixed economies. To me, this is the voice of what I call the great deception, the constant insistence that there is no alternative to whatever form capitalism is taking at the moment, including its historically most egregious form, which is the one we're living in at the moment. The reality, in fact, is that since 2008, we've been experiencing the implosion of the post-Cold War order. None of the terms of Rose's simple formula are functioning. All are either self-destructing, finance capital, for example, or self-immobilizing, governments. Their mixture is failing, and their support of each other has become anything but mutual. Meanwhile, other kinds of huge-scale socio-economic experiments are being undertaken by fragile nation-states around the world, with increasingly unpredictable results, as we can see in China in certain ways, and Brazil, for example, in others. The general picture, I think, is that the implosion of modernity will occur across decades to come. It will take many strange and unpredictable forms and will occasion many recurrences, but implode it will. The contemporary geopolitical economic world disorder is a yawning black hole, and around its rims are the ruins of Western modernity, the rejection of neoliberal globalization by its victims, particularly its so-called middle-class victims, the stalling state capitalisms of the BRIC nations, the desperate efforts by fundamentalists to establish pre-modernities, and the incipient warring for shrinking natural resources, in other words, the pushback from the planet. Everything except the last is failing. It's an effort to universalize that is failing, with drastic consequences. Climate science tells us that we have reached the limits of the Earth's capacity to sustain the material bases of all of these modern experiments. So the end of capitalism can be imagined. In fact, it must become imaginable. And in the seminar, we'll look at Paul Mason's arguments for what he calls post-capitalism, that are actually being taken up for example, in England by the Labour Party there. We'll also be assessing Naomi Klein's argument that this changes everything. In other words, that the world question has become a matter of capitalism versus the climate. We'll be filling our toolkit with instruments provided by the few but increasing number of large-scale thinkers who believe that tackling these questions is necessary, however impossible they may seem to be. Among them, Jacques Rancière, Arjuna Padarai, Edouard Glissant, François Julien, and a number of others. I'll just quote for a moment Bruno Latour, who argues that in recent years, and I quote, art, philosophy, ecology, activism, and politics have exchanged their repertoire in order to redefine the actors, the aims, the forums, and the motions of political involvement. He remarks that, and I quote him again, I've come to use the word composition to regroup in one term those many bubbles, spheres, that's Sloterdijk he's referring to there, network and snippets of art and science. It allows us to move from spheres to networks with enough of a common vocabulary, but without a settled hierarchy. It is my solution, he says, to the modern-postmodern divide. Composition may be a plausible alternative to modernization. What can no longer be modernized, what has been postmodernized to bits and pieces, can still be composed. So I'm in agreement with the spirit of that. The way it's being approached remains relatively sketchy. His compositionist manifesto, to which he was alluding with these remarks, in that manifesto, Latour is clear about the modernist values that such a document would exclude. It will exclude critique, which I would not, nature, which I would not, but in a different form, and progress, which I would, but that's complex. It excludes those things, but also offers little clue as to the values that should be included, preferring instead to emphasise the process of composing slowly, in detail, and collectively, in all forms of thinking and living, and with full respect to the materialities involved, what he calls the common world to come. So I think Latour and his team of researchers have made some promising starts towards answering some of the questions, particularly in the way they've identified a number of modes of existence. And I think we'll add that text to the AIME text to the seminar as well. But there's a core set of questions that remain, and they attract at the moment an array of only partial answers. Here's some questions. So out of what do we compose our worlds and the worlds to come? With which materials? How do we bring them together, and into which configurations? In which settings, in what kinds of conditions, and in relation to that which has been already given, the already unfolding worlds, do we compose? And as we compose, how do we trace changes in the ways of world composing over time, and in particular places? Is there, in fact, a composition of compositions? In other words, can we identify what might be called the contemporary composition? Probably not, but we probably have to try. So, claims about the kind of composing required by contemporary conditions are to be heard everywhere today. Once you start listing the terms that are widely used to evoke the essence of what it is to be in the world today, once you start trying to name the most important relationships between nations, economies and cultures, once you try and characterise the tendencies most likely to shape the world's future, you are making a claim about contemporary conditions. You're making a world picturing claim. There are many of them, but they don't arise randomly. So I have an argument about their currents, about how they cluster into currents. And there's only 3 of them. And what they do is they do what postmodernism told us they would do. They isolate modernity's master narratives, leaving them like beached whales. They proliferate divisive differences, but at the same time they channel these differences into a kind of contemporaneous configuration. So I'm about to sketch an historical argument about this about how is this happening. That's to say, an argument about the shape of historical forces that operate through the present. So I think they can be seen. If you frame it in a certain way, you can see these forces moving. Underlying the way I'm organising them, and I'll show it to you in a moment, is an intuition about a major shift in the nature of human thinking about thinking, and maybe in the nature of human thought, if we can still imagine such a thing. So it's in these currents and these shifts in thinking, these are the things that shape our understanding of today's world, I think, into competing clusters. We can identify the currents precisely by how they cluster our efforts to picture the world, how they try to organise the concepts and terms we use to do so. So I'm going to present to you in a moment a kind of meta-picture of world picturing. World picturing is already meta-picturing. I'm giving you a meta-picture of that process. So the first cluster, there are 3 clusters. There's a set that cluster as modernities, as efforts to continue modernities, if not modernity as such, as a base, but modernities of various kinds. And without going into any details about these terms, they're all very well known and recognisable. Each of them is a perspective on the world as a whole and a beginning a beginning effort to capture and cluster a narrative about how the world is changing now, under which you can then list a whole series of other points and write many books about each of these terms. But they're all huge efforts to world picture the world as a whole. They all have in common the sense that they wish to continue fundamental aspects of modernity, and usually capitalist modernity. So there's that set. There's another set I'll show you, between which there's a kind of dialectical oppositionality between these terms and the one I'm about to show you, but there's no resolution possible between them. So the next set I gather under the heading of transitional transnationality. You can switch the terms, transnational transitionality, putting the ideas of the nation state into a state of permanent transition. All states will never achieve their goal as imagined communities. They'll always be in transition, and they'll always be subject to external transformation. But each of these terms, again, decolonisation is a way of thinking about the way the world has changed since the 1950s. Digitalisation, vast movements of indigenisation around the world. And so they continue right through until various kinds of post-communism that operate at the moment. Clearly, these are ways of picturing the world that come from what used to be called the global south, the east, anywhere else but about the west. And they have, in fact, generated ways of world picturing, ways of thinking that are much more ancient than modern ways of thinking, that take very specific forms in the present, and they feed off each other and cluster like this. Many of them are cast in opposition to the continuing modernities that I just showed you. So that's another great current of ways of world picturing that works and is very active through the present. So between both of these and the set I'm about to show you now, it's not so much a dialectical struggle, but the creation of difference, of adjacency, of friction and antinomy, the continuation of irresolvable contradiction, but their co-presence. So I speak about contemporaneous difference as an accumulation of these ways of being in the world. Many of them do less, they're less committed to universalization or even to generalization. They're more about being in place in a small-scale way, but with awareness of much larger currents occurring, particularly the first two currents. But I think they have the energy, not just of the present, but of futures that are being created. All of the currents will create futures. But I think that the first two will fade in time, and various futures will emerge out of these elements that you see here. So if we put all those three together, and this is the most, there's lots of words here, but this is the most significant image that I can show you. I can actually make it available. It's on my website, so don't write down every word. That would be useless. But you can kind of see, I think, if you take, whoops, we'll go back. If you take what you're looking at here as framed by, where do we go here? As framed by just an artificial frame in the present, a world picture of currents moving like rivers or great oceans moving in relation to each other, and simply through here, with this one being continuation of modernity, but taking the forms it took since the 1970s, 1960s and 70s, 1950s and so on through here, and much more recently down below, you see this differential array of world pictures moving through time, that all of which point to actualities in the world. This is not just a discursive analysis. These are the signposts of world realities. And I'm hoping, it's only a hope, but it's a hope that the whole cluster is tending towards the coeval commons, the possibility of a coeval commons. So we can think about these currents in very fluid ways. We can think about them on analogy to the geological plates that constitute the Earth's mobile crust, powered by a sort of magma under the molten magma beneath it. It's kind of interesting that in planetary terms, what we're looking at is the supercontinent Pangaea fragmenting at the rate of 1 or 2 inches a year. In the next 500 million years, they'll gradually join together to form another supercontinent, a composite continent. And so you could say that this is the slowest rate at which the Earth's surface is actually composing itself. So this is world composition on the geological kind of level. But these sort of metaphors are not really enough. They imply the possibility of these slow-moving land masses or their relatively inert architectural edifices. They imply a certain static approach to the bodies of thought and the ways of world thinking that I'm trying to sketch for you here. Instead, we should think of those clusters, those currents, those 3 currents I showed you, as self-composing fields or as planes, P-L-A-N-E-S. Maybe planes, P-L-A-I-N. This is why not. Planes on which configuration occurs and becomes visible, or at least becomes apparent to the senses and therefore available to knowledge, to being named as ideas and shaped possibly maybe into ideologies. So instead of thinking of phenomena as things in unshaped space, we might think of phenomena, in this case conceptual phenomena, as that which becomes visible on planes, that's to say, as planomena. So that'll enable us to see how the 3 clusters I've identified are in fact symptoms of the contemporary configuration of these planes of world being. Philosophically, I'm obviously inspired by the claim of Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy? They claim that what defines thought in its 3 great forms, in art, science and philosophy, is always confronting chaos, laying out a plane, throwing a plane over chaos. It's like a net, I suppose, or a cut through chaos. They insist that these 3 great forms do so in parallel but fundamentally distinct ways. Thus they distinguish the plane of immanence within which philosophical concepts are formed. So that's kind of what I'm trying to create here, a plane of immanence in which concepts become visible in an array in relationship to each other. In scientific observation, where the effort is to define states of affairs or functions and references, the plane that's crucial there is a plane of coordinates, sort of mapping plane. And for artists, a plane of composition is crucial, where artists, as they say, wrest percept from perceptions and affect from affectations. That's what creates a plane of composition. So I can give you many, many examples, but I'll just give you one set in the work of Ai Weiwei. Look at 2 ways in which Ai Weiwei thinks about these issues. So in 2011, just before the Chinese authorities took down his website and put him in jail, he put on his website his page Concept, which is his effort to map the ideas that matter to him and to picture how they connect to each other. You can see it's got 3 anchors: life and culture, anchors all sorts of things like death, movies, karaoke, CTV, food, all sorts of stuff, love, sex, life and culture. Politics anchors another part of his world map, his conceptual map. When he thinks of government, corruption comes to mind, industry, and these. But of course, everything turns around China, concept of China, above which he has art and various breakdowns, and architecture, which is also an architect. So that seems simple and all on one plane, but the elements are kind of various. They kind of disappear if you try and put them in motion. They actually don't work as imagery in motion. But in his artworks, he has a slightly more vivid and subtle way of thinking about these things. Here he takes up the most familiar, what we call metageographic hyper-icon, which of course is the world understood as 7 continents linked by implied oceans. But he instantly invites us to see that what we normally read as a flat graphic or a spread over a sphere, a spherical globe as you saw before, he invites us to see it in 3 dimensions, as if the continents reach down to unfathomable space, as if there was no earth below, unanchored from their geological plates. These are just supports, sculptural plinths. They're not geological plates. So a sense of unfathomable instability is introduced into imagery we usually take to be absolutely fixed. But then we could reverse the reading. If you, instead of standing up on a ladder and photographing this, you go down, because the work is about 6 feet high. It gets up to between 5 and 6 feet high, if I think about it. If you go down and stand next to it, you can suddenly get the idea that this is a clustering of high-rise buildings. Apartments for the world's peoples, or at least those able to afford the indulgence of living in an apartment complex where all the buildings are shaped as if they're maps of the world, continents in the world. And I'm not making this up. In fact, if you want to go to Dubai, off the coast of Dubai, there's not only Palm Island that you can buy a house to live on, there's the world, a series of islands in which you can buy houses to live on. Or at least that started in 2003. Since 2008, the thing has been in such financial trouble that this world will never be built, we hope. But this work by ROA has some further dimensions. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen them already. When we notice the material that he's using, we see that this world has been cut from bolts of raw cloth, one laid above the other. We can see that the straight lines break it up into actual standardised sections. This is freshly produced cloth. It's just raw cloth. Produced, we suddenly sense we're in a factory. We're looking at the output of China's cotton industry, a vital cog in the global machine of globalised production. China's been the main supplier of the world's textile market in recent decades, 32% of total export, the export textile trade in 2011. The industry is also notorious for its exploitative labour conditions. This is a publicity photograph. It's nothing like this in most factories. So Ai Weiwei's world map makes us immediately aware of that economic globalisation is not only a worldwide phenomenon, but also a world-threatening phenomenon. And for China in particular, the party's efforts to maintain centralised state power while submitting the national economy, including its people, its workers, to the demands of a globalised economy that is unpredictable and incipiently uncontrollable, is shown in this work to be destabilising to its core. So the sculpture implies that these economic and political structures are as fragile as these layers of cloth. The layers of cloth have been stacked as high as you can stack them without them falling over. That's their limit as a form of sculpture. So if you look at the islands, which are too thin to be stacked very high, they're not very far. Tasmania in Australia hardly even begins to appear. So his visual imagination works by counterposing a flat graphic image with a three-dimensional and usually real-world material in order to suggest a critical idea. Usually an idea that in his country is unspeakable in public, unspeakable in discourse and unprintable in any public media. So in the case of the Sichuan province earthquake, where hundreds of children died in schools that collapsed on them because of corruption and ineptitude by the local government, something that was covered up by central officials, Ai Weiwei produced this work, The Snake, made out of the backpacks of school children. So what's going on when artists enable us to make connections like the ones you've just seen? How do we so readily move between such seemingly distinct spheres of life? It's crucial to represent the doubling involved when an artist wrests percepts from perceptions and affect from affectation. And it's crucial to value the supplements that doubling always produces. So I want to bring together the connotations of planarity, which is what we've been talking about, planes and planarity, with the concept of planetarity. Planetarity in the sense of relating to the planets and move in relation to the sun in our system and in other systems. So while these terms might seem to describe phenomena with entirely material and in principle measurable characteristics, in fact they're derived from the Greek words for the random seeming effects generated by uncertain causes. Planomenon was much used in Europe from the 15th to the 17th century as explanations were given of the unusual trajectories of the planets or wandering stars, the word being derived from Greek for bodies that moved erratically. Phenomena are also exceptional things, not just stuff. It's things that are exceptional. So today, in the threat of uncontrollable climate change, with inadequate responses to it by governments all over the world, individually but especially collectively, the questions returned. The question of planetarity has returned to the centre of our thought about the multiplicitous dimensions of contemporary world being, and it's become therefore pivotal to any imaginable futures. So how do we think about that? That's what I want to look at in the last part of this talk. As a first step towards identifying the operations of worlds within the world from a planetary perspective, we might imagine four such planes, a set of phenomena. Let's think about planes and we'll move towards planetarity. So if we think about Earth, planet, natural history, if we think about what becomes imminent, the most basic things that become imminent in the world, we could have that a set like this. And again, if we think of what's imminent for human being and for interiority for animals and for things and even perhaps for machines, we can have a level of sentient interiority. And if we think of relations between people, creation of societies, local cultures, again, societies moving across in this manner. And again, if we think about these on a world scale, these sorts of terms start to become important. So I think these are kind of irreducible arenas or fields of world being. And in this chart, they're arranged temporally from kind of origins to the present, going down both sides, in a sense. Earth, people creating societies and doing so on a huge scale. Raw information, machines, continues down here, dissipates down there. I was inspired to think in this kind of way, to begin to think in this kind of way, because I was appalled by the worldly thinking during the 90s of theorists of globalisation and government. Their theories about power and how it's disposing itself and should dispose itself in the world, such as Samuel Huntington and Joseph Nye. This is Huntington's ways of thinking about the West African cultures, see how the West wraps around him, includes Australia, Latin, Russia, and it continues. It's just, and his kind of thinking argued that these fundamentally civilizational differences were so ancient and they would flow through the present. They would in fact generate danger and war much more than resources or anything to do with the clash of nation states. They were enormously influential on the world picturing of the Bush administration and thus its disastrous efforts, its disastrous foreign policy and its interventions throughout parts of the world it had no business being in. So this is what I call a kind of strata-title approach to thinking about the world. It becomes important to not replicate that, but to actually try and pinpoint relationships that connect the planes I just showed you. And I'll just present this to you as a series of terms, again a series of terms that we use to connect, for example, earth and sentient interiority. Indigeneity or indigenous peoples' ways of being in the world as first peoples is the priority at that point. And you can suggest perhaps that art connects societies. That's the strongest kind of connection that occurs here. And forms of cooperation and diplomacy, hopefully, should connect geopolitics to our current world and the terms we use for our current set of temporalities. If you go down the other side of this diagram, you have pure information, virtuality, connecting machining, communication, networking, then it doesn't continue, doesn't flow. It's not a closed operation here. What operates and moves down through the centre of this kind of diagram is difficult to pinpoint, but power has got to be, power emerges and then has to be a kind of crucial figure. These are introductory ways of thinking about these things. And what we have to think, once we start to look at that, the thing that's most obviously missing is a series of qualities and characteristics which I actually saw in play when I was interpreting the Ai Weiwei work. And I call them connectivities. They're perceptions of connection and actual connections. They're actually actions in space and time. They repeat and expand patterns of acting. They change and develop over time. They're things that we're very familiar with, and we're doing it at the moment. So thinking is a connectivity. Thinking is a practice that connects many of these things in very specific ways. There's thinking about thinking as well, discourse analysis of the kind that is often done here by great thinkers such as Giorgio Agamben, Slavoj Žižek, Judith Butler, all of whose work we'll look at. And but as well as thinking in this basic sense, there's imagining and there's figuring. As the names I've just mentioned insist, figuring and imagining are crucial basic processes. And there's others such as feeling and projecting, identifying, communicating. There's a whole variety of quite ordinary terms that we use commonly. The most difficult thing to work with in what I'm putting before you, and something I've in no way solved, is to be able to track and trace these connectivities, which I actually can't diagramize either without producing an animation. The most difficult thing is to understand how they actually work and connect with the planes and with the states of becoming that I've shown you. The crucial thing, though, is that that's what we compose with. So world composing is what we're doing constantly all the time when we make the kind of connections, when we perform the kind of connectivity that I've just started to suggest to you are operating there. And this is the process of worlding. That's where the concept of worlding makes sense. It's a point where Peter Osborne and I concur very closely. He concludes a recent article by saying, and I quote, "The most successful post-conceptual work of art," which for him is contemporary art, is valid as and insofar as it's post-conceptual. He says, "It traverses, it crosses back and forth the internal temporal disjunctions that constitute the contemporary, constructing them in such a way as to express them at the level of the immanent duality, conceptual and aesthetic, of its form. Each work of art is a condensed fragment of the worlding of the globe." So that's my argument about contemporary art and its relationships to the contemporary condition in a nutshell. So I'll just conclude by two examples of a whole plethora of things. It shouldn't surprise us, it shouldn't surprise you, given what I've been talking about today, that the imagery of rivers flowing into the sea and oceans swirling across 4/5 of the planet should surface so strongly in the work of artists who are interested in exploring the primary planes of worldly connectivity. Richard Mishrak, for example, in 1998, spent much of the year travelling in the Mississippi River. We'll jump over those. I should have shown you those, but sorry. Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, taking photographs of the proximity in what is known locally as Cancer Alley of vast industrial estates and human habitations and the wetlands that result. The wetlands, they're right now undergoing this kind of disastrous coverage, the spread of water throughout this entire region right now as we speak. In 2010, Mishra went back to this area to work on what became the Petrochemical America exhibition and book project, and he worked with the landscape architect and graphic designer Kate Orff. And what they produced mixed his photographs of the devastated landscapes and so on and so forth with Orff's charts and diagrams that she called through lines that used public information to visualise over time, and in this case geological time, the whole series of kinds of time we've been talking about. The impact, the extent of resource exploitation, the disregard for environmental laws, the impacts on public health, and the incidence of political collusion in specific places up and down the river that's created, that was recorded in the photographs and created this Cancer Alley. So this world picturing that I'm showing you has become the preoccupation of thinkers everywhere. So it leads to a kind of contemporary question, the contemporary question. How can we shape the differences, our differences, into the constructive connections that the world requires? How do we move from the three-layered divisive differencing in contemporary world thinking towards the constant composing of worldly connectedness that's necessary for our survival as a species? So I began by citing passages from Gertrude Stein's essay, Composition as Explanation. It was composed, as I said, as an explanation of how its time composed itself and everyone living in it, and about how its time composed it, meaning the essay itself. Today, individual artists continue to strive to compose our contemporaneity, even as they are composed by it. But harmony or even homology between compositional spheres is hardly to be expected. Our time is struggling to compose itself. Or we might say, with equally awkwardly, our times are struggling to compose themselves. We see this struggle everywhere. It's rare, however, to find it expressed as a text authored by, in a sense, the world as a whole, or at least the official structures of the world. The impending disaster of climate change, which predicted impacts on all living beings, including the Earth itself, has led to the production of such a text. A kind of parallel to Gertrude Stein's, but it's a statement about the world as a whole, made in effect by the world as a whole. I mean, of course, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, affirmed by 195 nations in Paris on December the 12th in 1925. It's now undergoing a painful process of ratification by its member countries. It was only formed, it only took shape because of the years and years of work and protest, not just by diplomats, but above all by the peoples of the world protesting and insisting that this happens. The declaration opens with these words: recognising that climate change represents an urgent, potentially irreversible threat to human societies and the planet, and thus requires the widest possible cooperation by all countries and their participation in an effective and appropriate international response with a view to accelerating the reduction of greenhouse emissions. Hang on, that's the wrong one. Sorry. We will stay with this. I'll come to that one in a second. So what I just read out is what the statement began with, and it, of course, is based on, as you all know, an agreed action plan that is meant to build a consensus between developing, less developed, and at-risk nations. The moment it's voluntary. Of course, we know that the total of the proposals for reducing greenhouse emissions falls far short of what the world needs, not only because of the inequities of power between nation states, but also because of the fragility of consensus on these issues within many, indeed most of these states. Nonetheless, the negotiators in Paris were aware that they had to proceed by acknowledging these inequalities, while at the same time affirming the aspirations of all parties, places, and polities. As the groundwork, they insisted on the universality of a number of rights, items they regard as essential components of any viable world picture. So this is this accumulation of world representatives trying to speak in a world voice. It's very instructive to compare it to the kind of voice that Gertrude Stein was able to bring together. Acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humankind, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of Indigenous people, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women and intergenerational equity. So on the face of this is United Nations officialese, but each of these expressions is of specific consequence for millions of people. This, however, is not yet the voice of the coeval commons I was speaking about. It's not as conceptually advanced, for example, as the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, developed by a unity pact between Bolivia's 36 indigenous groups in Cochabamba in 2008. Instead, it really represents the struggle that the world has now to compose itself. It's a patching and pasting of contending values. It reveals just how far we've got to go before we can explain, even to ourselves, how we might, in fact, do what we must do now, which is create a contemporary composition for the sake of the planet. Thank you.